from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, from Netflix to TikTok to Samsung, the exodus from Russia continues, and the pressure to do more piles on. Plus, Coinbase starts blocking sanctioned Russian users. What about the rest of the crypto world? An FTX president joins us this hour to talk about their conversations with regulators and new services being launched in Europe and the Middle East. And Apple holds its first event of the year Tuesday. You can expect updates to the iPhone, iPad, and Mac lines. We're going to bring you a preview later this hour. All of that in a moment, but first, turmoil in the global markets. U.S. stocks plunging, the most in 17 months. Our Ritika Gupta painting the full picture. Ritika, still big concerns about what's happening with oil.
Yes, indeed, Emily. It is another down day for U.S. equities. We've got the S&P 500 ending the session down nearly 3%. It's back into correction territory. And the Nasdaq 100 underperforming, down some 3.75%. But as you mentioned, the real story was in the oil market, where we saw WTI at one point as high as $130 a barrel, then back to $119. So a lot of volatility in today's session, off the back of those headlines on whether indeed Russian energy supplies would be sanctioned. And that actually brings me to the bond market, because yes, yields on that 10-year inching higher today, but in the grand scheme of things, 1.77% on that 10-year in the face of what is surging energy prices and that US CPI print that we're going to get this week, which economists expecting an 8% handle on that. And speaking of inflation, what has really not been a hedge today is, well, Bitcoin, because that has gone below the $38,000 threshold. So we're raising the gains that we saw last week when it was just starting to look a little bit more favorable again, because really year to date, Bitcoin has just been trading sideways. And it brings back that debate, is Bitcoin a risk off or risk on asset? And today you do see some of those crypto related movers, the likes of Marathon Digital, getting hit in today's session. And I also want to just focus on your other movers of the day. Some of those big cap tech names, Apple and Amazon, moved down lower in this session along with the broader market. In times like these, we have often seen them being those safe haven plays, but we haven't seen that of late, have we, Emily?
Right. The question, what is a safe haven now? Ritika, thank you. Russia has now vaulted past Iran and North Korea to become the world's most sanctioned nation in the span of just 10 days following President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In a surge of action led by the U.S. and European allies, Russia now the target of more than 2,700 new sanctions for a total of more than 5,500 sanctions. Our Josh Wingrove joining us now with more, who of course covers the White House for us. So look, Ritika outlining there the market fallout continuing. What's the signal from the White House, Josh, about how far this will go?
That it's just going to keep going, Emily, and just, you know, we don't know the specifics, but just the pace is remarkable, both overall, 3 decades to build this sort of Russian economy, just a couple of weeks to really substantially remake it at best, bring it to its knees at worst. And some of the measures that they were talking about early in the West, were sort of ruled out about a week ago or so, and then it only takes a few days, it seems, for things to go from unlikely to plausible, even probable, or already announced. And so we're seeing that sort of continued pace. President Biden had a call with his counterparts in France, Germany, and the UK earlier today. Their joint statement afterwards pledged sort of continuing efforts. So this, read into that what you will. Of course, there are calls for the U.S. in particular to restrict imports of Russian crude oil directly to the U.S. It's a little unclear how many or which other countries would follow that if they did go down that path, and frankly, how much they would go down that path to begin with. Europe, of course, trying to wean itself off Russian gas, natural gas for heating in particular, to try to get some leverage there. But they're I guess, scraping the back of the cupboards, if you will, looking for anything and everything short of putting boots on the ground, of course, in Ukraine.
Right, and these ongoing calls in Congress to bar Russian oil. What is the administration's latest thinking here?
Yeah, they're sort of in wait-and-see mode. This is a big one. It definitely fits in the category of things that were sort of unthinkable not that long ago and now have some real traction. There is bipartisan movement in Congress to move here. Of course, Joe Biden is worried about the price of gas here. It's soaring in the U.S., and that is political liability for him. They don't want to further strain markets, in particular if they brought in a ban with sort of immediate effect that might disrupt shipments that are sort of already in train or about to be. So I think that right now Congress is working towards a bill. The response from the White House today, spokeswoman Jen Psaki saying there's not a bill yet, it hasn't passed, the president hasn't made a decision on this file yet, so really pumping the brakes on that one from the White House. They're considering it, but not signaling yet, or taking the step of doing it, of course, about whether they're going to ban Russian oil imports.
All right, fast-moving situation. Josh, thank you for your reporting there. Now, as the conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate, so does the risk of cyber attacks against Ukraine and its allies. Just weeks ago, we are now learning that hackers gained access to computers belonging to current and former employees at nearly 24 major natural gas suppliers and exporters, including Chevron and Kinder Morgan. EQT Corp, the largest producer of natural gas in the United States, also saying it's been targeted by a rising number of cyber attacks since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Here's CEO Toby Rice.
We have seen the hits on our system increase significantly since this conflict began in Europe. The biggest threat to Russia is American natural gas. So when you think about what they're going to do to preserve their power, it's shut down American oil and gas.
I want to bring in Matthew Olney now for more on this. He's the Director of Threat Intelligence at Cisco Talos Intelligence Group. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I understand you're seeing a new wave of crowdsourced cyber attacks on both sides of this conflict. How would you describe the state of play? What are you seeing?
It's a pretty crazy situation right now in terms of traditionally we look at these kind of conflicts and we have one side and another side, maybe in this case Russia and Ukraine. Now we have the Conti ransomware group coming out on the side of Russia. We have the Ukrainian cyber police soliciting volunteers online to attack websites in Russia. We have lots of different players who feel that now is the time for them to kind of put their stake in the ground and go after what they believe in. And that kind of raises the stakes on the international stage of a possible misunderstanding between nations.
And what could that lead to, a possible misunderstanding between nations?
Yeah, look, attribution is always difficult, like knowing what's happening when you're looking at attacks on the ground, and nations have to respond to that. So if someone hits something in Russia, for example, and Russia misinterprets that as an attack from the United States or an attack solicited by the United States, then their response will come the way of the United States. It just adds chaos to an already dangerous situation.
Well, CISA is also urging U.S. companies to lock down their systems in case the Russian government or private hackers take action. It could, in fact, already be happening. You've got companies like CrowdStrike and Ping and Cloudflare offering their help, offering their services for free. What would you say is the threat level right now against U.S. businesses, U.S. entities?
Yeah, it's all down to how Putin decides to engage the West. How do they respond to these unprecedented sanctions that have been put in place? Ultimately, we think that there's largely, they're very capable in the energy sector. We've seen them for a decade or more in the energy sector, gaining a foothold, gaining understanding of those systems. And so there's a threat there, but we also think that there's a possibility that there could be a tit for tat sort of thing where they're going after the financial sector as well, which is a harder nut to crack in the West.
I want to take a look at Ukraine specifically, and you talked about all of these different entities coming to the defense of Ukraine. We're talking about from the EU to Lithuania to Romania to all of these different companies. How effective do you think this has been, and is this a path towards sort of further deterrence, cyber deterrence in the future when you see the rest of the world piling on?
I have a hard time thinking about cyber deterrence when you see the level of kinetic warfare going on. Like cyber is a piece of this story, but this human side is also much more distressing. What I would say in Ukraine, it looks like Russia has underestimated on all battle spaces Ukraine, both in terms of how their military will respond and how the West will respond, but also in terms of how solid their cyber defenses are. Ukraine spent the last 2 years well in terms of putting together defenses And you know, Cisco's proud to have a role in that, in kind of providing actually on the ground support right now for critical infrastructure, ensuring that those systems stay up when the Ukrainian people need them the most.
There's also movement in U.S. Congress to take greater action on cyber attacks. You've got massive cyber legislation, which would require companies in critical sectors to alert the government of potential hacks or ransomware. You've got the ball now in the House's court. What's your take on this legislation? Is this something that you would like to see advance?
Anytime I see the government like, you have to notify us of something, my question is then what are you going to do with that information? I like that it's centered in and around CISA, because CISA has positioned itself as the sort of go-to agency in the United States to provide information both to the private sector and to government networks at risk, and gives a really good understanding of what our actors are using in terms of their attacks. So I think centering the information there signals that's how they want the information used, and I think that's a good place to put that information.
Now, look, the war on Ukraine is escalating, it seems, by the hour. What does that escalation look like in cyberspace? How bad could this get on both sides?
You know, again, you know, the cyberspace element has been much quieter than we anticipated, and I think that's because Russia has kind of underestimated what they need to do in that space. And I think right now they're going to so overcompensate in the kinetic space that the cyberspace side inside of Ukraine just isn't of interest to them. And I think they're using their best resources right now, engaging in espionage on the West to understand what the red lines are and what the exit strategies are for everybody.
Matthew Onley of Cisco. Matt, thank you so much for bringing us that perspective. Meantime, the Russian government blocked Facebook as part of its efforts to silence dissent and limit information about its invasion of Ukraine. A post from Russia's communications regulator, Roskomnadzor, said Facebook would be blocked because of, quote, discrimination against Russian media and information sources. Facebook previously banned Russian state-backed media accounts from operating in the European Union in an effort to cut down on Russian propaganda and misinformation. Coming up, American Express joins the likes of Visa and MasterCard in suspending its operations in Russia and Belarus, crippling the ability for everyday transactions as more companies from Netflix to TikTok take stands around the world. That is next. This is Bloomberg. A continued exodus of businesses out of Russia. How does MasterCard, American Express, and Visa suspending operations there impact everyday Russians? Bloomberg's Victoria Cavallari explains.
Visa, MasterCard, and American Express have become the latest international companies to suspend operations in Russia to punish the country over its invasion of Ukraine. What this means from a practical standpoint is that if you have a Visa or MasterCard issued by a Russian institution and you attempt to use it outside of the country, let's say here in New York to buy a cup of coffee, that transaction will not go through. Similarly, if you have a Visa or MasterCard issued outside of Russia and you attempt to use it with a Russian vendor, that transaction will also no longer work. It will be denied. So for example, if you live in Russia and you have a bank with a foreign institution, say Chase in the US, and you have a card issued through Chase, you won't be able to make any purchases in Russia. Here's what this means for Russian citizens. If you live in Russia and you bank with a Russian bank and you attempt to use your Visa or MasterCard in the country, they will continue to work. The Russian central bank said that they can process those payments in the country. Caveat to that is that once those cards expire, they will no longer work. However, if you're a Russian citizen and you're any place else in the world and you pull out your MasterCard and you bank with a Russian bank, you're out of luck. Further, even if you bank with a Russian bank and you try to make a foreign purchase, something online, it also will not work. This is another attempt to financially isolate the Russian government and to put pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin to get him to reverse course in Ukraine. Western governments have rolled out a series of sanctions, and private companies like Visa and MasterCard have undertaken their own financial punishments by pausing operations in Russia, suspending business, closing up shop. The Ukrainian president had requested that Visa and MasterCard undertake these measures in the hopes that it will pressure Russia to stop the war.
Meantime, other companies continue to shut down operations in Russia. Netflix says no new customers will be able to sign up. TikTok is suspending live streaming in the country after Putin's so-called fake news law. And Samsung is stopping all product shipments to Russia, including smartphones and chips. Bloomberg's executive editor, Tom Giles, with us now, along with Techonomy founder David Kirkpatrick. David, Tom, thank you. Obviously, it's very complicated to figure out just how this is impacting everyday Russians versus the Russian government versus Putin himself. David, what do you make of this exodus? What strikes you most about these companies taking a stand, whether they have large businesses in Russia or not?
Well, clearly, digital information is an intrinsic part of the modern economy and how people are able to stay informed. And sadly, the Russian government does not want its people to be informed. So I think most of the consumer digital information companies like TikTok, Facebook, Google are trying their best to continue operating on the grounds that they help people stay informed at a time when otherwise they would have difficulty doing so. But many of them are finding that it's simply untenable. So Netflix and TikTok shut down in Russia because new laws that Russia has just introduced as part of their suppression of information make it possible that they or their employees might be prosecuted. So these companies are in a very difficult position.
Now, Ukraine's Vice Prime Minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, Tom, has been pretty aggressive about calling out these big tech giants. Specifically, most recently, he's called on Amazon and Jeff Bezos to make some moves there. He also called on Apple and Google to shut down the Play and the App Store. Do we have any indication that Amazon, for example, is going to cut off some of its services to Russia?
So overall, we haven't heard specifically from Amazon recently. Overall, you have to keep in mind, you asked earlier about cutting off Russia and possibly taking a hit to business. A lot of these companies, by and large, now there are some exceptions, but by and large, the U.S. technology industry is not heavily exposed to Russia. If you were to erase Russian business altogether, which some of the companies are doing, you're talking about a small sliver of overall revenue. So in terms of this being a sacrificial move on the part of big U.S. companies, let's keep it in perspective. Now, the other thing is they're being compelled to do this in many cases because of U.S. sanctions. You don't want to run afoul of the U.S. rules, and every day there seems to be another set of sanctions levied against Russia. Secondarily, there's the practical implications. How can you do business, even if you want to do business, in a country where you can't make payments, you can't accept payments, where Visa and MasterCard aren't accepted, where banking facilities are being shut down right and left? So there's the practical element. And then lastly, I think there is the moral element. It does behoove these companies to take some sort of a moral stance, even though it's not necessarily going to be a big sacrifice from them on the sales side of things.
We are also seeing non-U.S. companies take stands here, David, like Samsung, stopping sending products and chips to Russia. Apple, I understand their business in Russia is fairly small, but does Samsung have a larger business in Russia, and is that of more consequence to them?
I think it will be. I think what they said is they're not going to ship new product to Russia, which means probably that Samsung phones and other equipment that's already in Russia will be still available. But this will have major consequences, no question. And I think the set of sanctions and actions in net really will hurt the people. There's no way it can avoid hurting the people. But I think that's just unavoidable as a consequence of the sanctions and the situation.
Right. And there's a question, Tom. Is it a good thing, or is it the right thing to do to be hurting the Russian people, many of whom don't necessarily support this war?
Absolutely. And that gets back to the point David made earlier, is the information the flow of information is not something that you want to necessarily stop. If you're Twitter, if you're Facebook, the list goes on, TikTok, their services are getting throttled, and to some degree, these companies are cutting back on their own services, YouTube ad sales, for example. But do you want to deprive the Russian people of the flow of information? Say, for example, here's how here's a group of people in solidarity over opposition to the Russian government. Here's the flow. Here's actually what's going on. Here's the news and information that's actually calling out the Russian government for the invasion of Ukraine. As we've noted, this law that was passed last week puts really tight limits on how you can even talk about it, the words you can use. Don't call it an invasion, for example.
Google search, meantime, David, as I understand it, still works. Also, YouTube and WhatsApp are hugely popular in Russia. Are these services that you believe should stay turned on? I mean, there are pros and cons to both arguments here.
I think in the case of those three, it would be beneficial if they could continue operating. I think somebody might say, if Google in particular, if it were turned off, it would harm the government's ability to function and the economy, because we know everybody uses search. But for now, I think making those services still available to ordinary citizens is important. YouTube has a huge role as an information conveyor in Russia. And I think WhatsApp, which is encrypted, is probably a critical tool to continue making available to the Russian people, if possible.
Right. Certainly likely not the last of this long list of companies taking action on Russia. Techonomy founder David Kirkpatrick, our very own Tom Giles, thank you both. Coming up, more and more companies, as I mentioned, cutting ties. We're going to also speak with the CEO of Kohl's, Michelle Goss, about how she expects global economic uncertainty to impact consumer behavior later this hour. This is Bloomberg. A few other stories we continue to watch. DoorDash considered a takeover bid for London-based Deliveroo, but the two sides failed to reach an agreement. This according to the Sunday Times. The U.S. food delivery service reportedly met with Deliveroo over the summer while exploring plans to expand in Europe. Instead, DoorDash bought the Finnish food delivery startup Volt for about $8 billion. And Mandiant soaring as much as 20% after the information reported Google is in talks to acquire the cybersecurity company, marking what would be Google's second largest transaction ever. Bloomberg reported last month that Microsoft was in discussions to buy Mandiant, which has a market value now of about $5 billion. Coming up, beyond Ukraine, Meta and other Silicon Valley giants have another challenge on the horizon, staying attractive to tech workers here in the United States as share prices fall. All the details on that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. For years, employees of Silicon Valley's largest companies could count on one constant, and that is a rising share price. But now, with shares of the biggest tech companies dropping at least 11% in recent months, in some cases more, employees are now unsure about their fortunes, and it's increasing the odds of a rush to the exits. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner, who covers Meta, Twitter, and other companies for us. Kurt, how exactly are these share prices impacting employee retention? I mean, obviously it was going up for so long, and this is kind of a massive jolt.
It is, right? I mean, if this has been your norm for years that you would get stock every year with part of your salary, and a few years later it would be worth 50% more than it was when you got it. Suddenly, when you are going the opposite direction, that catches some people by surprise. I think if the entire tech industry is kind of moving downward together, it probably helps retention somewhat because you don't necessarily you're going to another company where the stock is diving. But in general, obviously, companies want this number to be going up because employees want to stay and work at a place where their paychecks are getting bigger every other quarter. So I think it's just the reality of the fact that the tech industry right now is hurting, and we haven't really seen that happen for a really long time.
So are you hearing from employees who think it's just not necessarily worth it anymore to keep working at, a Facebook or an Amazon because the stock just isn't worth what it used to be? Or do they still believe in the mission and want to push forward?
I think that there's just so many opportunities out there that unless you are one of these big companies and offering a really attractive financial package to people, there's other things they can go do to make, a livable, great tech wage, right? And so I think whereas before this idea that, hey, I'm getting in Amazon today because I know 4 years from now when all my stuff vests, it's really going to be worth twice as much, right? That was a mindset that I think a lot of people had. And one of the, not the only, but certainly one of the driving factors for why these companies are so popular with recruiting. Now, if you don't necessarily have that belief, right? If you think, hey, a lot of what I'm going to get today might be worth the same or maybe even less in the future, well, there's just not as much incentive. And so maybe people go build a startup on their own, right? Or maybe they take a chance on something that's a little bit less established because they don't necessarily feel like they're definitely going to get the return that they were used to expecting.
And these companies have been dealing with a whole host of issues over the last several years: privacy, antitrust, increasing, in the case of Meta, for example, really deep-seated brand issues. But in the last 2 weeks, I wonder how much of that has changed with the war in Ukraine and the uncertainty. How does that play into choices? I mean, certainly we've been seeing people resign and reshuffle across the board, but I wonder, do we see a pause now?
Well, I think this is one of the challenges as these companies get really big is how do you continue to attract people that really believe in your mission, right? And what is your mission? Now, 10 years ago, Emily, you probably remember working at Facebook was like, hey, we're changing the world, right? We're connecting people in a way that didn't exist today. And now you work at Facebook and it's just PR headache after PR headache, right? And so I think finding people who maybe believe in those missions of the Amazons, Googles, Facebooks, these really big companies with tens of thousands of employees, I just think it's a harder sell. And so as a result, when something like Ukraine is going on, just something that's a real world issue, I think it puts a lot of that other stuff into perspective from people who might not have been as bought into that mission to begin with.
All right, Kurt Wagner for this. I'm sorry. I'm sure this story will continue to evolve, Kurt. Thank you.
Thanks.
Meantime, the massive list of companies halting business with Russia keeps growing as they take a stand against the war in Ukraine. This as U.S. stocks plunge, inflation rises, and rising gas prices with a possible ban on Russian oil loom. Joining us now, Kohl's CEO Michelle Goss. Michelle, great to have you with us. I know it's your investor day, and you have to be thinking about the macroeconomic picture here. What are you bracing for in terms of how this global tumult could impact consumer behavior?
Yeah, Emily, well, it's a great question. It's a great point. I mean, we are navigating unprecedented times, just like we have the last couple of years. And there's a lot of uncertainty and concern out there for sure. I'd say from a Kohl's standpoint, we're staying very close to the customer. We've demonstrated we can be agile and resilient during this time, the global pandemic, supply chain issues and the like over the last couple years. And today is our Investor Day, and we got to share some really exciting news. I mean, as we look ahead, we have great confidence in our business, lots of growth drivers. I'm sure we'll talk about that, but we're also present to the fact that there is pressure. We have reflected that in our guidance to investors. We've taken note in our margin headwinds as it relates to things like freight and cost. At the same time, from a customer standpoint, we want to be really sensitive to the pricing pressures. I think one of the real advantages we have here at Kohl's is our brand portfolio, and we have aspirational, iconic national brands like Nike and Levi's, and we've got great entry price point brands that are private label. So we can meet the customer wherever they are. And like I said, we'll be agile and responsive. It's probably also worth mentioning one of the things we announced today is the next evolution of our loyalty program. So if you have a Kohl's charge, you get 7.5% back in Kohl's Cash, which our customers really value.
What do you think could be the biggest macro challenge for your customers? Is it inflation? Is it geopolitical turmoil? Is it supply chain challenges? And by the way, do you have factories in Russia?
So, we're a domestic company. Clearly, from a supply chain standpoint, that is the area that we pay attention to, as well as the inflationary pressures. I think it's hard to speculate in the midst of this, all the uncertainties with the consumer, and that's why it's so important for a business like ours that serves 65 million customers that we do put the customer first and that we understand them. But I think it goes back to, what is on their mind, how they're purchasing, and Kohl's serves America. 80% of America lives within 15 miles of a Kohl's. We serve lots of things that's really important to their everyday lives. As we shared with our investors today, this pivot into the active and casual lifestyle, how they're living today, moving into beauty. So these are all needs that we expect that they're going to continue to have. But like I said, we'll stay flexible and agile as we understand and navigate the current situation.
Kohl's has gotten a couple of unsolicited takeover offers over the last couple of weeks, and also just released a filing an hour ago that says your advisor, Goldman Sachs, is in talks with 20 potential buyers. Can you give us the latest on this and talk about how your plan addresses some of these investor concerns and some of this investor interest?
Yeah, you bet, Emily. So first, let me clarify the plan we put together and what we shared today with a lot more detail is something we, the board, the management team, really believes in and have great conviction that this is going to create tremendous value to our shareholders. And we have retained Goldman Sachs. We have a finance committee that's part of the board. Our board is being extremely thoughtful and doing their fiduciary duty as we evaluate all opportunities in front of us. Yes, we have had engagement with roughly 20 parties. We've had some unsolicited bids. We've also done some outreach to make sure that we are doing our job as a board to evaluate these options against a very strong plan. And ultimately, all of this will be considered as we decide our path forward. But I'll end with, as we look ahead, we've guided growth for the business. We have game-changing ideas that we're pursuing, like Sephora, expanding active, even building 100 new stores. So we feel really well positioned. But like I said, we will evaluate all options in front of us.
You've said Sephora can become a $2 billion business. When do you see hitting that goal? And what proportion of sales do you see coming from digital versus on-foot in-store traffic?
Emily, we haven't put a very specific date out there on the $2 billion, but let's say it's in the medium horizon. We're in the midst of building out 850 shops. They're going to be a very big contributor. And to your point, digital will be a reasonable contributor to that. That's one of the advantages we have with such a strong omni-channel platform. And candidly, it was one of the reasons I think Sephora wanted to partner with Kohl's, because we have such a strong footprint. It's convenient. It's off mall. We have a growing digital business. We're taking advantage of that omni-channel power with things like buy online, pick up in store. And we do that today with our stores that are open. But we're going to test an idea where we're going to do BOPUS, leveraging Sephora.com, their site, and driving customers into a Kohl's shop. And there's not that many examples. I can't think of one of companies that are doing that kind of cross-company BOPUS. So, I'm excited to continue to build out this business with them. It's a very big idea. And like I said, in terms of the growth, 1,200 stores, and we're growing our digital business to, looking to grow an $8 billion business from $6 billion today.
Right, and I know you're launching some more self-checkout, buy online, pick up in store options, which have been popular. Michelle Goss, Kohl's CEO, good to have you back with us. Thanks, Michelle, for stopping by. Coming up, crypto exchange FTX expanding to Europe and the Middle East. We're going to talk with FTX U.S. President Brett Harrison about this new move as calls from regulators to block Russian crypto clients rise. This is Bloomberg. We have seen some wild divergences in crypto since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now the Bloomberg terminal is expanding the number of cryptocurrencies that users can track. Check it out at crypt.com. Go, CRYP, on your terminal. And it is time now for our crypto report with our crypto contributor, Sonali Basak. What is the terminal showing us, Sonali, that's new here?
There's a few things here, and there's Bitcoin prices to start with. We have to talk about Bitcoin because of the last week. It did decline most of the last week, Emily, with an extra nearly 3% drop, more than 2% drop over the last 24 hours or so. But when you look at Bitcoin over the last week, we do have to look at the other coins as well, the other cryptocurrencies as well, and see how they fared in relation to them. We know Bitcoin is falling alongside other risk assets like stocks, but if you look at Ethereum here, it did have a steeper decline than Bitcoin had. It's not that all of them are doing so poorly, though, in the last week. If you take a look at Tether, it's remained not only fairly stable, it's actually getting a little bit of a lift over the last day and the last 7 days here. So we are seeing a difference here between the stable coins and the more traditional cryptocurrencies as we take a look about the meaning of cryptocurrencies in this new era we're headed into.
All right, Sonali, thank you. Stay with us. I want to bring in our next guest, FTX U.S. President Brett Harrison, to talk about their expansion to Europe and the Middle East and so much more. Brett, obviously so much going on in the crypto market right now. This question of whether crypto is decoupled from more traditional assets or not. Meantime, you've got this big launch in Europe, in the Middle East. Why now, and when will we actually see these new services begin?
Sure. So FTX operates globally. Between FTX and FTX US, we operate in over 180 jurisdictions. But in many of those jurisdictions, it hasn't been completely clear exactly what regulation, what licensing is required in order to be able to operate and expand the services that we can offer to citizens and in these different jurisdictions. And so what we've been doing is working in every country possible to get licensed in any way that we can, so that we are fully set to offer all the services that we can in a licensed way. And this is very much to counteract this narrative that crypto companies are operating outside of the regulatory regimes and envelopes, that they want to avoid being able to have the same kind of rules applied to them as traditional financial markets. It's the opposite for us. We want to be a part of the regulatory discussion and work cooperatively with the different agencies in these different countries to be able to be regulated. And so we're very excited about FTX EU. We have the CySEC approval to be able to offer that ftx.com/EU domain in the different places where we can passport that particular license. And we'll be able to launch within a couple of days all those services.
Well, speaking of changing regulation, there has been increasing pressure on crypto exchanges to block Russian clients in accordance with sanctions. You've got Coinbase saying that they are now doing this. What is FTX's position on this? Are you blocking sanctioned Russian entities or users?
We have been blocking sanctioned Russian entities from the start, from before even the war with Ukraine had started. FTX as an exchange is required, for example, by FinCEN to be able to uphold AML and sanctions according to the various sanction lists that we check. That includes the OFAC sanctions list, FBI most wanted, Interpol consolidated sanctions lists. And we do an extraordinary job of making sure that those sanctioned entities and individuals cannot transact cryptocurrency through the exchange. It's a different matter entirely to consider whether we would, on our own, make the private decision as a company to block every single Russian user, regardless of their appearing on those lists or not. And so we're in constant dialogue with Treasury, with members of the Treasury who are telling us what they want us to do in terms of helping to uphold the global public policy decisions that they are working on with the executive branch.
Speaking of keeping an eye on what users are doing and what was happening over at Coinbase, I mean, the idea that 25,000 addresses had to be blocked as a result of their own kind of internal look under the hood here. Bring us under the hood over there a little more at FTX, because what is the scale of which users around the world could be engaged in illicit activity, and where is it mostly coming from?
Right. I read that report from Coinbase, and if you dig in, most of those addresses were found from prior to when the conflict started. And so I think what Coinbase was trying to do is show that, look, there's been discussion back and forth about whether cryptocurrency exchanges like Coinbase and FTX are actually doing their job of holding sanctions. The answer is we are. And in fact, every single day, we have to block sanctioned activity, whether that's from Russia or from any other particular nation or individual appearing on these sanction lists. And that didn't start just now with the conflict in the Ukraine.
I'm wondering also, when you take a look at kind of the broader way that people are thinking about cryptocurrency in this era, you know, as you expand into Europe, as you look at the ruble conversion, not just to Bitcoin, but to stable coins, which is apparently happening at an even greater scale, how do you see this conversion over from traditional currencies moving into digital assets?
So what we're seeing, for example, in the Ukraine is people converting cryptocurrencies into the fiat currency into cryptocurrency. It's a natural thing to do in a wartime economy where there might be uncertainty about the currency. In other nations, maybe not during wartime, but they also might have hyperinflating currencies, and they're looking for some flight to a more safer asset that they're able to transport cross-border easily, as long as they're not sanctioned. And so we see that as a very real thing that's happening right now, especially if you look at all of the activity, cryptocurrency activity entering Ukraine to help aid the effort there, whether it's directly to Ukraine addresses or to NGOs on the ground helping with humanitarian efforts. So I think this is showing a lot of the power of cryptocurrency as this instant settlement cross-border payment that can be a flight from currencies that might not be stable.
Right, but is it really? I mean, if you look at the drop in Bitcoin today, it's certainly gone down with the rest of the market. And I know we're going day by day here, but longer term, you know, what is the recommendation to new, potentially aspiring crypto investors as to how to think about this asset and whether you're facing more or less risk here than in something more traditional?
Of course. If you look at Bitcoin prices themselves, there's definitely volatility. But if you look at Bitcoin prices, maybe, for example, versus the Turkish lira, that graph still tends to go up and to the right. If you have a country with a currency that's hyperinflating, if people don't want to invest in the asset itself that might have this volatility risk to it, what they can do is they can convert to a stable coin like USDC, which is completely one-to-one reserve back with the dollar, in which case they can store their assets in a digital form that is completely stable and pegged to the dollar, and therefore be able to escape the risk from their own currency hyperinflating. And so that's a way in which people can still interact with the digital currency system, but not necessarily leg into the risks associated with volatile currencies that they may be less certain about.
Okay. Brett Harrison, FTX US president, and our own Sonali Bostic. Thank you both. Coming up, Apple setting the stage. A new version of the iPhone and iPad may be unveiled at tomorrow's event. This comes right as the tech giant makes a big step, cutting off business in Russia. We'll discuss next. This is Bloomberg. Apple is holding its first event of 2022 tomorrow, with the tech giant set to debut new versions of the iPhone and updates to the iPad. Joining us now, what to expect, our very own Mark Gurman, who covers Apple. Mark, what are you watching?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, this is exciting. This will be the first Apple product launch event of 2022. I'm expecting the Mac Studio. This would be sort of a hybrid, smaller Mac Pro, larger Mac Mini, really aimed at the professional market. You'll see Apple's most advanced non-Intel chip in a Mac to date in this computer. Launching alongside that will be a new low-cost monitor, right? This will be their first new external monitor in about 3 years. This is likely to be less than half the price of the current monitor, which costs between $5,000 and $6,000, depending on the texture you get on the front glass, depending on the stand, if you get the stand or not with the product. There also is going to be a new iPad Air, as well as a new iPhone SE, both with 5G and potentially a few other things on the docket. So should be a fairly exciting day if you're a fan of the iPhone SE, if you're a fan of the iPad, and you're a fan of the Mac.
We've already seen Apple take a stand on Russia and its position there. I know that Tim Cook often makes a nod to world events at the beginning of these presentations. Are we expecting to hear some commentary from him on the war on Ukraine tomorrow, or for Apple to take potentially an even stronger stand? You've got Ukrainian officials calling on Apple to cut off the App Store to Russia.
So we know what they did last week by stopping exports into the country, stopping sales. They removed Sputnik News and RT News from the app stores outside of Russia. Actually, today, Emily, they took another step. They stopped search ads, which is the ability for developers to place advertisements for their apps in the search results of the App Store. They did this in Russia. As of now, it appears that most of Apple's services, whether that is the App Store itself, iMessage, Apple TV Plus, Apple Books, et cetera, are still available in Russia. Of course, there have been calls for those to be disabled. We will see if Apple will do that. In terms of if Tim Cook will make a statement about the Ukraine situation, traditionally they have done this, right? They have had to re-record the beginning of events because of world, matters going on. So I would not be surprised if they do this. They actually did this for their shareholder meeting last Friday as well.
Mark Gurman, we'll be watching. You will be as well. Thank you so much for giving us that roundup. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Tomorrow, International Women's Day. We've got Julie Osk of Forrester Research. She'll talk about the Apple event. As always, Dina Shakir, prominent venture capitalist, and Liz Young of SoFi, talking about global markets.